The movies have been kind to historical pirates, giving the entire practice a sheen of excitement and romance. Sure, pirates were thieves and criminals, but in a charming anti-hero sort of way. In literature and films, being kidnapped by pirates and taken to sea is often a passport to adventure, rather than an invitation to be brutally killed and have your corpse dumped in the ocean. Sadly, real-life piracy involved a whole lot of that second thing. So, today we're walking the plank on all the gruesome ways pirates used to whack people. But before we get to Davy Jones' locker, make sure you've subscribed to the Weird History channel. After that, head on down to the comments and let us know what other historical bad boys you want to hear about. Okay, time to chop off those sea legs. Before we get to all the skullduggery, let's dive into some pirate history. The term piracy refers to any act of robbery or violence at sea, or sometimes attacks launched from the sea onto coastal settlements. Documented instances of piracy stretch back as far as the 14th century BCE, impacting early societies clustered around the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. Typically, though, when the topic of pirates is raised, people aren't talking about ancient raiders in the Aegean. The pirates everyone imagines when they hear the term are largely from a period of around 80 years, stretching from the middle of the 17th century through around the year 1730. A few major trends in this period led to an explosion in maritime crimes and buccaneering expeditions. As trade between Europe and major colonies across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans exploded, the value and quantity of the cargo being shipped increased significantly. This period's rise of piracy coincided with a reduction in size of several major European navies. Pirates flourished when there were few legal authorities on the open seas to take them down. Too bad the Top Gun Squadron didn't exist back then. Some governments also found piracy useful in certain situations. Cash-strapped colonial governments would occasionally fund their own buccaneering missions in order to balance their books, and major nations tolerated or even encouraged piracy if costly and distracting attacks were aimed at their adversaries. The Golden Age is typically subdivided into three periods. The buccaneering period, lasting from around 1650 to 1680, was primarily focused on the Caribbean, just like in The Ride, only somewhat less whimsical. English and French sailors, many of them based in Jamaica or Tortuga, would attack nearby Spanish colonies, interrupting trade with the Old World. In several cases, these operations were funded and commissioned by French and English officials, who had recently taken control of colonies formerly held by the Spanish. To the victors go the booty. Around the 1690s, there was a shift to what historians call the pirate round, in which English pirates started sailing beyond the Caribbean looking for larger scores, often traveling as far as the Indian Ocean in search of lucrative targets. Finally, by the end of the 18th century, piracy entered what's called the post-Spanish succession period. After the Treaty of Utrecht and other accords ended the War of Spanish Succession, many European sailors left the military and found themselves without steady work. A winding down of the European slave trade also boosted unemployment among the ranks of sailors, many of whom now had experience with violent work. This led again to a rise of piracy in far-flung destinations well beyond the Caribbean, including the Indian Ocean, the West African coast, and the American colonies dotting the East Coast. By 1720, piracy was already on the decline, mostly because European nations had grown weary and started to purposefully crack down on the practice. While the end of the War of Spanish Succession briefly bolstered the pirate ranks, this, in turn, motivated European navies to staff back up in order to protect their merchants and vessels. Though it was a relatively brief period, the Golden Age nonetheless gave permanent rise to our pop culture fascination with pirates and the buccaneering lifestyle. Still, Hollywood's largely bloodless versions have been sanitized for mainstream consumption. Real historical piracy was closer to a Mortal Kombat game. A few of the more violent pirate threats and torture methods have made their way into mainstream pop culture. Keel hauling, for example, was a popular form of punishment among pirate crews. In keel hauling, the victim is tied to a line, looped beneath the vessel itself, then thrown overboard, causing the victim to be dragged beneath the ship's keel, which was typically coated in barnacles. Eventually, they're pulled up on the other side and given a moment of peace before being plunged beneath the ship yet again. Some reports suggest that the Dutch Navy occasionally keel-hauled soldiers as a disciplinary practice in a non-fatal fashion. But pirate crews were not so accommodating. Typically, the victim would be pulled beneath the ship so violently or repeatedly as to cause them to drown, lose limbs, or be decapitated. Punishments were meted out on a pirate ship for all manner of offenses, but the consequences for whacking a fellow crewmate were particularly harsh. According to some pirate codes, any sailor who took the life of another crew member without authorization would be tied to the crew member's body and thrown overboard. Another pirate punishment that's frequently described in the historical record is known as sweating. The captain would force a prisoner to run up and down the full length of the ship, while the crew poked and pierced them with swords and other sharp instruments. Usually, this resulted in fatal lacerations, which is why modern-day fraternities use paddles instead of swords. But of course, the most infamous consequence of getting on a pirate's bad side is being forced to walk the plank. In such cases, captives were bound, blindfolded, and forced to walk along an extended beam off the ship into the roiling waters below. Unlike keel hauling, which had both fatal and non-fatal variations, walking the plank was strictly intended for people they never wanted to see again. The first mentions of walking the plank in the historical record came from English writer Francis Grose's 1788 book, Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, which provides a definition for the term. However, there are only a few actual recorded instances of people being made to walk the plank in real life, suggesting it has taken an outsized role in our imagination about the pirate era. In fact, several supposed eyewitness accounts of walking the plank appear to be either invented or have no connection to piracy. In his 1724 book, A General History of Pirates, for example, Captain Charles Johnson describes walking the plank, but he was talking about an ancient Roman practice rather than something contemporary. The real origin of our modern fascination with walking the plank appears to be literary rather than historical. Robert Louis Stevenson's 1884 novel, Treasure Island, which significantly informed many of our modern ideas about pirates, contains 3 mentions of walking the plank. Stevenson's novel is likewise the origin point for pirate tropes, like buried treasure, hanging out with parrots, and replacing missing limbs with peg legs. And the Disney film adaptation is where the classic pirate voice comes from. Yar! François l'Olonnais was quite a real French pirate, active during the early days of the buccaneering era. He first arrived in the Caribbean as an indentured servant, but after completing his term of servitude, he landed on what's today the island of Haiti and took up a new criminal career on the high seas. In 1666, along with fellow pirate Michel Le Basque, l'Olonnais sacked and pillaged the city of Maracaibo in present-day Venezuela. During this campaign, he gained an infamous reputation for torturing the island's residents, convincing them to reveal the locations of their greatest riches. After brutalizing, robbing, and burying the residents of Maracaibo and burning the city for good measure, l'Olonnais and his men moved on to another town, San Antonio de Gibraltar, where they killed 500 more soldiers and held the entire remaining population for ransom. An expedition to Honduras in 1667 was somehow even more brutal. According to a 1684 account of the journey by Flemish writer Alexandre Exquemelin, while making his way inland to the city of San Pedro, l'Olonnais managed to capture 2 Spanish soldiers. L'Olonnais allegedly did some impromptu surgery and chewed out one man's heart, threatening to do it to the other survivor if he didn't show him the best route into the city. Ultimately, l'Olonnais failed to take San Pedro, and after being driven back by natives, he and his men were whacked by a local indigenous tribe. Like many pirates, he kind of had it coming. Alexandre Exquemelin also wrote extensively about an infamous Welsh pirate named Sir Henry Morgan, with whom he traveled throughout the 1660s and early 1670s. In his writings, Exquemelin accused Captain Morgan, it sounds familiar when you say it like that, of employing torture and brutality in service of his goals. According to his writings, Captain Morgan was particularly vicious. He once tied a captive up with 4 stakes, placed a 200-pound boulder atop his body, and repeatedly burned his skin in different places. Exquemelin also tells us that after sacking the city of Portobello in present-day Panama, Morgan used enhanced interrogation on city officials to track down the area's most valuable treasure. The pirate captain's alleged methods included a technique known as woodling, in which a leather cord was strapped around a victim's forehead and gradually tightened with a metal bar, which would ultimately cause the victim's eyeballs to pop out. For some reason, this is not depicted on any Captain Morgan bottles. Morgan's various campaigns against the Spanish made him a popular figure in England, and he received a hero's welcome there in 1672. Morgan eventually returned to Jamaica as the territory's lieutenant governor and served for the next decade or so in the colony's legislature. So when Excamelon's History of the Buccaneers of America was translated into English in 1684, Sir Henry took issue with the book's depiction of his sailing career. Because when you're lieutenant governor, you can lie about your extensive pirate career. In an affidavit, Morgan swore that he had always opposed piracy and always had and still has hatred for buccaneers. The court ruled in Morgan's favor, and certain passages of Excamelon's account were retracted in future editions. Maybe we need to pull a Taylor Swift and get an Excamelon's version going. He also refers to a Dutch pirate named Roche Brasiliano, but this was probably a pseudonym for a man named Gerrit Gerritsen, which, if your real name is Gerrit Gerritsen, why bother with a pseudonym? Nobody's going to believe that's your real name anyway. Brasiliano/Gerritsen was notable for his cruelty, even among pirates. In one particularly colorful account, when two Spanish farmers refused to turn over their pigs to him and his crew, Brasiliano tied them to wooden spits and roasted them alive, like the Ewoks. Most chilling of all, no one knows whatever became of Roche Brasiliano. All accounts of him and his misdeeds stop in 1671. And he was apparently never heard from again. It's unclear whether he and his men were lost at sea or simply retired under different names, thus permanently evading justice. Arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age was Welshman Bartholomew Roberts, better known to history as Black Bart. He's famed for capturing over 400 ships, creating his own pirate code outlining conduct on his ships, and adopting an early version of the iconic black skull and crossbones flag. But Black Bart achieved this prominent level of success through some pretty horrific practices. Frequently, after plundering a vessel, Bart would seek to make a quick getaway by lighting it on fire and sailing on his own boat off into the horizon. Unfortunately, he did this without giving the burnt ship's crew or passengers adequate time to make their escape. One anecdote suggests he left 80 enslaved people to burn alive in a ship because he didn't want to take the time to unshackle them before fleeing the scene. Needless to say, this has yet to make it into a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. But even worse than Black Bart was English pirate Edward Lowe, who is usually singled out as the most cruel. Sherlock Holmes creator Sir Arthur Conan Doyle once referred to Lowe as savage and desperate, and a man of grotesque brutality. Remarkably, Lowe developed this reputation despite only being an active pirate for around 3 years, from 1721 to 1724. So you know he was working overtime. One of Lowe's favorite torture techniques, which he famously taught and passed on to protégés like pirate Francis Farrington Spriggs, involved tying a victim's hands up with rope placed between their fingers. Lowe would then set the rope on fire, burning the victim's hands, sometimes cleanly down to the bone. No wonder pirates drank rum all the time. At least the movies got that right. So what do you think? Did any of these stories change how you think about pirates? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.